What would you do if the only thing your father left you was a patch of sun-scorched dirt everyone called worthless? Elara Vance was left just that, 160 acres of cracked earth and bitterbrush, an inheritance that earned her little more than pity and scorn from the hard-bitten folks of Redemption Creek. But what the town didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that her father, a man who mapped the hidden veins of the earth, had left her one other thing: a heavy, sea-worn trunk full of secrets. What lay waiting inside those rolled parchments was a truth that would rewrite the future of the entire valley. Stay close, and let us know where you're watching from, as we uncover the truth buried deep in the dust. The stagecoach groaned into Redemption Creek under a white, unforgiving sun, leaving a plume of alkali dust to settle on the weathered plank buildings. Elara Vance stepped down onto the hard-packed street, feeling the stares of the few townspeople who lingered in the slivers of shade. They remembered her as a girl, daughter of the eccentric cartographer Silas Vance. Now they saw a woman of 25, dressed in a plain, travel-worn dress, her face etched with a quiet sorrow and a weariness that went deeper than the journey. She carried a single, faded carpet bag, its contents the sum of a life she had tried to build elsewhere, a life that had failed to take root. She had been gone 10 years, chasing a teaching position in a green, civilized town back east, a world away from this raw, unfinished country. A terse telegram had summoned her back. Father passed, effects held, lawyer Hempstead. The words were as sparse and brutal as the land itself. Lawyer Hempstead's office was a small, stuffy room above the mercantile, smelling of dry paper and stale tobacco. He was a man whose skin seemed to have been cured by the same sun that baked the adobe bricks of his walls. He cleared his throat, avoiding her eyes as he slid a slim folder across his desk. Your father's will was straightforward, Miss Vance. He had little in the way of liquid assets. Inside the folder was a single deed. The block letters spelled out the property's designation: Section 23, Township 14 South, Range 31 East. But underneath, in her father's spidery, precise hand, was the name he had given it: the Barrens. 160 acres, Hempstead continued, his tone a practiced mixture of sympathy and dismissal. South of the dry wash, not much for grazing, no water rights to speak of. He paused. There is also a trunk, from his workshop. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, surfaced. Her father, his back to her, hunched over a massive table covered in maps, the smell of ink and vellum. She, a girl of 15, asking him to come to the town social. He had just waved a hand, his eyes never leaving the intricate lines he was drawing. The earth is speaking, Elara, he had murmured, as if that explained everything. You have to learn its language. She had slammed the door then, furious at his remoteness, his preference for rock and contour lines over his own daughter. The distance between them had grown like a fissure in dry ground, too wide to cross by the time she left. Later that day, Silas Croft, the owner of the livery stable, helped her move the trunk. He was a man as solid and dependable as the oak posts that held up his barn, his face a roadmap of kindness. He was the only one in town who met her gaze directly, his eyes holding no pity, only a quiet welcome. Your father was a good man, Elara, he said, his voice a low rumble. He just saw the world a little different. He set the heavy trunk down in the corner of the small, clean room he'd offered her behind the stable. It was made of dark wood, bound with brass that had turned green from sea air, a relic from a life her father had lived long before he came to the desert. That night, under the faint glow of a kerosene lantern, Elara knelt and lifted the heavy lid. It didn't smell of the sea. It smelled of the earth, of dust, dry pine, and old paper. It was filled to the brim with rolled parchments, dozens of them tied with twine. They weren't maps of any place she knew. They were covered in strange, swirling lines, geological notations, and symbols that looked more like music than cartography. She picked one up, unrolling it carefully. It depicted the valley, but it was rendered in alien colors, with faint blue lines tracing paths that had no relation to any known river or creek. At the bottom, in her father's elegant script, was a single phrase, aqua fretus, the sleeping river. The words meant nothing to her then. They were just the last, cryptic ramblings of a man she had never truly known, the final testament to the gulf between them. She sat back on her heels, the weight of it all settling in her bones. She was alone, with nothing to her name but a worthless plot of land and a chest full of beautiful, useless drawings. The next morning, Ilara walked to the general store, a short list of necessities folded in her pocket. The air inside was thick with the smells of coffee, leather, and smoked bacon. A group of men were gathered around the pot-bellied stove, though it was cold, their talk falling silent as she entered. Among them was Jedediah Thorne, the valley's most prosperous rancher, a man whose presence filled any room he occupied. He was large and loud, his wealth announced by the silver on his belt buckle and the confidence in his booming voice. He recognized her immediately. "Well, if it isn't little Ilara Vance all grown up," he said, his tone dripping with false cordiality. "My condolences about your father. A strange man." But he kept to himself. He took a step closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial rumble that was still loud enough for the entire store to hear. "Listen, out of respect for his memory, I'd be willing to take that parcel of his off your hands. The barrens. Can't do much, but I'll give you $20 for the deed. Enough for a stage ticket back to wherever you came from." A few of the men snickered into their coffee cups. $20 was an insult, but for land everyone knew to be worthless, it was also seen as an act of charity. Ilara felt a flush of heat crawl up her neck, but she kept her expression neutral. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But it's not for sale." Thorne threw his head back and laughed, a great booming sound that rattled the tins on the shelves. "Not for sale? Girl, what do you plan to do with it? Raise rocks? You'll be back here in a week, begging me to take it." He waved a dismissive hand and turned back to his audience. The matter settled in his mind. Ilara paid for her flour, salt, and coffee, her movements precise and deliberate, her face an unreadable mask. She walked out into the blinding sun, the laughter following her. It was then that her quiet grief hardened into something else, something stubborn. Silas Croft saw the look on her face when she returned to the livery. He said nothing, just helped her load her supplies into a small, sturdy buckboard. When they were done, he led an old mare out from a back stall. The horse was the color of the dust, her coat bearing the marks of a long life, her eyes gentle and intelligent. "This is Dusty," Silas said. "She was your father's. He'd want you to have her. She's slow, but she's sure-footed, and she knows the country." He handed Ilara the reins. He trusted her, he added, and Ilara understood this was the highest praise Silas could offer any living creature. That afternoon, she once again opened the trunk in her room. This time she wasn't looking at the maps as a final, sad mystery. She was looking for a reason for her father's obsession, a reason for her to defy the laughter of an entire town. She unrolled map after map, spreading them across the floor. They were beautiful, intricate things. One showed the strata of rock beneath the valley, layered like a cake, with notes on porosity and permeability. Another charted the prevailing winds, another the patterns of summer lightning strikes. It was the work of a man who saw the desert not as a single, static thing, but as a living system of immense complexity. Her eyes kept returning to those faint, impossible blue lines that snaked across the parchments. lines that seemed to connect disparate, meaningless points on the surface. She found the map that specifically detailed Section 23, the barrens. A single blue line, thicker than the others, ran directly beneath the center of the plot. She traced it with her finger, a whisper of an idea taking shape, a fragile possibility that felt as foolish as it was hopeful. What secret was her father trying to tell her through these strange, beautiful maps? Was it the rambling of a lonely man, or a key to unlocking the desert's heart? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of hidden strength. Now, as the sun rose over Redemption Creek, Ilara knew she had to see the land for herself. She set out the next morning, the buckboard loaded with her meager supplies, Dusty harnessed and pulling with a slow, steady rhythm. The town watched her go. Most saw a fool's errand, a stubborn girl marching toward defeat. As she passed the last building, a small adobe house with a shaded porch, she saw old man Hemlock sitting on a bench, a piece of cottonwood and a knife in his gnarled hands. He was ancient, a relic from a time before the town had a name, and rumor said he had known these lands when the only maps were the stars. He didn't look up as she drew near, but his voice, a dry rustle like leaves skittering across stone, carried on the morning air. Your father listened to the stone's memory, he said to the wood shavings at his feet. You got his eyes, see if you got his ears. The words were a riddle, and Ilara had no answer for them. She just nodded in his direction and urged Dusty onward. The road dwindled from a wide, rutted track to a pair of faint lines in the dirt, and finally, to nothing at all. The landscape grew harsher with every mile. The sagebrush gave way to greasewood and thorny mesquite. The earth itself seemed to give up, the soil turning to a pale, cracked clay that shimmered under the relentless sun. Jedediah Thorne's mocking laughter echoed in her mind. What do you plan to do with it? Raise rocks? The doubt was a physical weight, pressing down on her, making the air harder to breathe. Was this an act of tribute or an act of sheer folly? A memory surfaced, unbidden. She was 12, and her father had taken her out to a high ridge overlooking the valley. He had knelt, placing his palm flat against a large granite outcrop. Can you feel it, Ilara? He had asked, his voice filled with a rare, quiet excitement. The hum, the deep music, it's the planet breathing. She had felt nothing but hard, warm rock. She'd rolled her eyes, impatient, wanting to get back to town, to her friends. The memory was now a source of deep, aching regret. She had spent a lifetime not listening, and now she was alone in a world defined by a silence she didn't know how to interpret. Late in the afternoon, a rider approached from behind, moving at a fast clip. It was Thorne, mounted on a magnificent black stallion that ate up the ground. He reined in beside her small, plodding buckboard, the contrast between his prosperity and her poverty stark and cruel. He tipped his wide-brimmed hat with an exaggerated theatrical politeness. "Enjoying your kingdom, Miss Vance?" he called out, a smirk playing on his lips. "Found any gold nuggets lying about?" Ilara didn't grace him with a response. She kept her eyes fixed between Dusty's steady, twitching ears, her hands holding the reins loosely. Her silence seemed to amuse him more than any retort would have. He chuckled, a low, contemptuous sound. "Don't get too lost in your thoughts out here," he said, his voice hardening slightly. "This land has a way of swallowing people who don't respect it. And this piece of it," he gestured vaguely ahead, "has no respect for anyone." He spurred his horse, kicking up a cloud of dust that enveloped her and the wagon, and galloped off toward the hazy horizon. The dust settled, coating her face and clothes in a fine, gritty film. She just squared her jaw, a silent promise to herself, and urged the old mare forward. An hour later, as the sun began its long descent, she saw it. A single, sun-bleached wooden post driven into the cracked earth. On it, carved by her father's hand, were the initials SV. She had arrived. The sight of the land was a physical blow. It was worse than she had imagined, worse than the town's most derisive descriptions. It was a picture of perfect desolation. The ground was a mosaic of deep, sun-baked cracks. A parched and broken skin stretched over barren bones. The only vegetation was a scattering of skeletal, thorny bushes and the occasional clump of bitterbrush, gray and defeated. In the center of the plot stood a small, dilapidated cabin, its roofline sagging as if exhausted by the effort of standing. The door hung from a single leather hinge, swinging listlessly in the hot breeze. This was her inheritance, a monument to failure. For a long moment, she just sat in the buckboard, the reins limp in her hands. The impulse to turn around, to ride back to town and hand the deed to Thorne for his insulting $20, was overwhelming. The entire endeavor was madness. The town was right. Thorne was right. Her father, in the end, had been just a dreamer who had mistaken a wasteland for a canvas. But then, Dusty, who had stood patiently through it all, let out a long, slow sigh, a sound of weary but profound acceptance. The old mare lowered her head and began to nibble at a stalk of dry grass. The simple, stubborn act of survival resonated with something deep inside Alara. She felt a kinship with this tired, overlooked animal, a shared refusal to simply give up. She would stay, at least for one night. She unhitched Dusty, leading her to a patch of slightly less forbidding ground and setting out a small measure of oats and a bucket of water she'd hauled from town. She made her own small camp near the buckboard, not yet willing to brave the derelict cabin. As the sun dipped below the distant mountains, the desert began to transform. The brutal, flat light of midday softened into a breathtaking palette of orange, rose, and deep violet. The oppressive heat gave way to a gentle, cooling air. The silence she had felt earlier as an emptiness now seemed to fill with a vast, watchful presence. The stars emerged, not as faint, distant specks, but as a brilliant, teeming river of light arching across a sky of pure black velvet. She built a small fire from the deadwood of a long-gone mesquite, the flames a tiny point of human warmth in the immense darkness. She ate a simple meal of bread and jerky, the maps from the trunk spread on a blanket beside her, their cryptic lines glowing in the firelight. Later, she lay down in the wagon bed, wrapped in a blanket, staring up at the celestial map above. She thought of her father, and for the first time, the anger and regret were joined by a sliver of understanding. Perhaps he hadn't been running from the world. Perhaps he had been seeking a connection to something deeper, something truer. That night she dreamt of water. It wasn't the image of a river or a lake, but the sound of it, a low, resonant hum running deep, deep underground, a vibration she could feel in her bones. She woke with a start just before dawn. The world was held in that strange, suspended moment between night and day, bathed in a soft, gray light. The air was perfectly still. She sat up, a sense of unease prickling her skin. Something was different. She looked for Dusty, expecting to find her tethered near the wagon. But the mare was gone. A jolt of panic shot through her. Then she saw her. Dusty was standing stock still in what looked to be the exact center of the property, her head down, her body rigid with attention. She wasn't grazing. She wasn't sleeping. She looked for all the world as if she were listening, with an intensity that sent a shiver down Alara's spine, to the silent, sleeping earth beneath her hooves. Alara slipped out of the wagon bed, her bare feet silent on the cool, dusty ground. She walked slowly toward the mare, her heart thumping a steady rhythm against her ribs. Dusty didn't move as she approached, her focus absolute. Her ears, those reliable barometers of a horse's attention, were swiveling slightly, aimed directly at the ground. Ilara stopped beside her, following the mare's gaze. The ground looked no different from any other part of the plot. A flat, cracked expanse of pale clay. She knelt, her hand hovering just above the surface, feeling for a vibration, a temperature change, anything. There was nothing. She was about to stand, to dismiss it as the strange behavior of an old animal, when the first direct rays of the rising sun sliced across the land. The low, angular light threw every subtle imperfection of the terrain into sharp relief. And then she saw it. It wasn't the large, obvious fissures caused by the sun. It was a network of incredibly fine, almost invisible cracks, no wider than a thread. They radiated outward from a central point directly beneath Dusty's hooves, forming an intricate, delicate pattern like the veins of a leaf or the crystalline structure of a snowflake. It was a pattern of profound and deliberate order in a landscape defined by chaos. Even then, her rational mind tried to explain it away. A trick of the light, a natural geological formation of no significance. But the image was seared into her memory, an anomaly that refused to be dismissed. She led the still reluctant Dusty back to the wagon and gave her a drink, her mind racing. Later that morning, she forced herself to confront the cabin. She pushed open the groaning door and stepped into the gloom. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light piercing the broken roof. The air was thick with the smell of decay and abandonment. A broken chair, a rusty tin cup, a scattering of mouse droppings. It was a place of profound loneliness. But on the one wall that remained mostly intact, her father had tacked a single large sheet of vellum. It was an unfinished map of this very plot of land. With trembling hands, she fetched the maps from the trunk and carefully unrolled them on the dusty floor. She found the master map of the valley, the one with the strange blue lines. She located her section, her plot. And then she saw the connection. The faint, almost imperceptible blue lines that her father had drawn, the ones he'd labeled aqua fretus. They mirrored the patterns of the fine cracks in the earth outside. The central point where Dusty had stood corresponded precisely to a place on the map where several of these lines converged into a single, darker blue node. It wasn't proof. It was barely a theory. It was a ghost of a possibility built on an old mare's intuition and a dead man's cryptic drawings. She didn't act on it, not yet. The idea was too fragile, too enormous to be tested by the brute force of a shovel. Instead, she spent the rest of the day simply observing, walking the land with new eyes. She noted how the hardiest plants, the ones that clung most tenaciously to life, grew in faint, subtle rows that seemed to follow the path of the cracks. She saw how the morning dew, in the few minutes before it was burned away by the sun, collected and clung to those same hairline fissures. The land was speaking a language, just as her father had said, a language of whispers and subtle signs. For the first time, she felt she might be on the verge of understanding a single word. That evening, as the sun set and cast long, dramatic shadows across the valley, she sat on the cabin floor, surrounded by the maps, a single lantern pushing back the immense darkness. A quiet, fierce resolve began to burn within her. The next day, the real work began. The decision to stay was no longer a matter of stubborn pride, but of profound, consuming curiosity. She would not be digging for water. She would be digging for an answer. She started with the cabin. It was a practical necessity, but it was also a way to claim the place, to impose a small measure of order on the desolation. She scavenged planks from the collapsed portion of the roof, painstakingly pulling out the old, rusted nails. She rehung the door, patched the worst of the holes, and swept out the years of accumulated dust and debris. The physical labor was grueling. It was a raw, aching effort that left her muscles screaming and her hands raw. Her most pressing need was water. The barrels she'd brought from town were nearly empty. Silas had told her of a brackish well, more of a seep, a half-day's journey from her plot. Every other day she would make the trip, a slow, plodding journey with Dusty and the buckboard, returning with 2 barrels of alkaline water that was barely fit for drinking. The trips were exhausting, a constant draining reminder of the land's defining scarcity. Her hands, already calloused from her life back east, grew tougher still. They cracked and bled, then healed into a new layer of hardened skin, a testament to her toil. Throughout it all, Dusty was her silent, steady companion. The old mare seemed to understand the rhythms of their new life. She would stand patiently for hours while Alara worked on the cabin, or pull the heavy water wagon without complaint. Her presence was a quiet anchor in the vast, lonely silence. In the evenings, Alara would brush the mare's dusty coat, her hands moving in a slow, meditative rhythm, the simple act a comfort to them both. When she wasn't repairing the cabin or hauling water, she was walking the land. She began to create her own map, overlaying her observations onto a copy of her father's. She paced out the lines of hardy greasewood. She sketched the intricate web of hairline cracks. She made notes on the texture of the soil. Old Man Hemlock's words echoed in her mind. He listened to the stone's memory. She started to understand. Her father hadn't been drawing what he saw on the surface. He had been interpreting the story of what lay beneath. The lines weren't random. They were fracture zones, ancient faults, the deep grammar of the stone. She began her own ritual of listening. At dusk, when the heat of the day had bled out of the ground, she would lie down, pressing her ear to the cool, packed earth, trying to sense the deep hum she had dreamt of. Most nights, she felt nothing but a profound stillness. But in one spot, the very place where Dusty had stood that first morning, where the cracks converged, she sometimes thought she could feel something. A faint, almost imperceptible thrum, less a sound and more a feeling. A vibration that seemed to rise from the very core of the earth. This was the place. She took the pickaxe and shovel she'd found among her father's few tools in the cabin. The metal was pitted with rust, the wooden handles worn smooth by his hands. She hefted the pickaxe, the weight of it unfamiliar but satisfying. She swung, bringing the point down hard into the baked clay. The ground was like iron. Each swing took a measure of her strength, chipping out a pitifully small amount of dirt. Hours turned into days. The town, through the occasional passing rider, heard of her strange activity. The story that circulated was that the lonely Vance girl had finally lost her mind, that she was out in the barrens digging her own grave under the mad desert sun. The mockery had a new, sharper edge of pity to it. But Alara didn't hear it. The only sounds in her world were the wind, the cry of a distant hawk, and the rhythmic clang of her pickaxe striking the earth. Then, late one afternoon, the sound changed. It wasn't the dull thud of metal into dirt. It was a sharp, resonant clang. A sound that vibrated up the handle of the tool and into the bones of her arms. She had struck rock, but it was a rock that rang with a strange and promising hollowness. Days of painstaking labor followed. She traded the pickaxe for the shovel, clearing away the dense, packed soil. Slowly, painstakingly, a shape began to emerge. It was a vast, flat slab of pale sandstone, its surface scored with the same intricate network of hairline cracks she had first seen on the surface. In its center was a smooth, shallow depression, like a natural basin worn by water that hadn't flowed in 10,000 years. Her hands were raw, her back a knot of pain, but a feverish energy drove her onward. She scrambled out of the pit she had dug and ran to the cabin, grabbing her father's journal. She had been working to decipher his cramped, technical script for weeks. Flipping through the pages, her eyes scanned for any mention of the rock. She found it. Next to a detailed cross-section sketch of the sandstone formation was a short, cryptic passage. Where the breath of the deep earth surfaces. Capstone. Listen for the hollow song. Pressure sealed by geologic time. A natural artesian seal. The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Capstone. Seal. She wasn't digging a grave. She was uncovering a well. Her father had known. He had mapped it, understood it, and left the final step of discovery for her. This slab of rock was the only thing standing between this parched, thirsty land and the sleeping river he had written of. She found a long, heavy iron bar in the cabin, likely used for prying rocks from the harder soil. It would have to be her lever. She wedged one end into a fissure at the edge of the great stone slab. Dusty stood at the edge of the pit, watching her with intelligent eyes, a silent, four-legged witness. Ilara put her entire weight against the bar. Nothing. The stone was immense, a solid piece of the planet's skeleton. It did not move. She tried again, grunting with the effort, her muscles straining to their absolute limit. Sweat dripped from her brow, stinging her eyes. It was impossible. She was about to give up, to collapse in exhausted defeat, when she heard a deep, grinding groan. It was a sound that seemed to come not from the rock itself, but from the earth beneath it. The stone had shifted. Only an inch, but it was enough. A puff of cool, damp air, smelling of wet stone and ancient, undisturbed places, washed over her face. It was the earth's exhalation. Reinvigorated, she worked the lever back and forth, slowly, patiently, widening the gap. An hour later, she had moved the capstone enough to reveal a dark, circular opening, about 3 feet across. Her hands trembled as she lit the kerosene lantern. Tying a length of rope to its handle, she slowly lowered it into the darkness. The flame descended, casting flickering shadows on the rough-hewn sides of a natural shaft. It went down 10 feet, then 20, and then the light stopped reflecting off stone. It reflected off something else, something that shimmered and moved with a life of its own. Water. A pool of it so clear the lantern light seemed to pierce to its very bottom. She pulled the lantern up, her movements dreamlike. She knelt at the edge, staring into the dark opening. Her father's maps, the ones the world had dismissed as worthless fantasy, were spread in the dust beside her. The blue lines were not rivers. They were the veins of a vast, hidden aquifer, a slow-moving underground river system. And this spot, was a natural artesian well, perfectly sealed and preserved by the capstone. He hadn't left her a plot of barren land. He had left her the source, the heart. Tears she hadn't known she was holding streamed down her dusty cheeks, carving clean paths through the grime. They were not tears of sorrow or loneliness, but of a profound, shattering, and deeply healing understanding. She finally knew her father. Her discovery remained a secret, a precious and private communion between her, the land, and her father's memory. Her first priority was to protect it. Using stones she gathered from the surrounding area, she began to build a low, circular wall around the opening, a proper wellhead. It was slow, heavy work, fitting the stones together like a puzzle. But every rock she set in place felt like an act of devotion. She rigged a simple pulley system with a bucket and rope, and the first time she drew up a full measure of the water, her hands shook. It was cold, clear, and tasted sweet, with none of the brackish, mineral tang of the water from the distant seep. It was the purest water she had ever known. As she was setting the final stone in place, she noticed a change in the sky. The brilliant, cloudless blue had been replaced by a sickly, yellowish-brown haze on the western horizon. The air grew still and heavy, charged with an electric tension. A dust storm was coming, not a common whirlwind, but a true duster. a rolling wall of sand and wind that could strip paint from a wagon and scour the very soul of the land. She worked quickly, securing everything that could be blown away. She led Dusty into the small, sturdy cabin, which now felt less like a ruin and more like a fortress. She barred the newly repaired door and shuttered the one small window just as the first gust of wind hit, a physical blow that made the whole structure groan. The world outside dissolved into a howling, roaring chaos of brown. Day turned to a suffocating twilight. Sand, as fine as flour, found its way through every tiny crack, coating everything in a gritty film. In the heart of the storm's fury, she heard a sound that did not belong, a desperate human shout, nearly torn away by the wind. Peering through a small crack in the window shutter, she could just make out a dark shape in the maelstrom, not 50 yards away. An overturned wagon, huddled against it, trying to shelter from the sand-blasting wind, was a family. A man, a woman, and 2 small children. Their horses, panicked by the storm, had broken their tethers and fled. Without a second's hesitation, Alara wrapped a scarf around her face, took a deep breath, and unbarred the door. The wind tore it from her grasp, slamming it back against the cabin wall. Leaning into the gale, she fought her way toward them, each step an immense effort. She reached the terrified family, shouting over the roar of the wind, guiding them back toward the faint light of her cabin. They stumbled inside, collapsing on the floor, coughing and half-blinded by the dust. They were the Millers, a family heading west, their dreams and possessions now scattered and buried by the storm. Their water canteens, she saw, were empty. She gave them what was left in her own water barrel, but it was a meager amount. The storm could rage for days. This was the test. Her discovery, her secret, was about to be shared. It was a choice, made in an instant. She took the bucket and went back out into the screaming wind, this time to her well. Shielding the opening with her own body, she lowered the bucket into the darkness. It came up heavy, brimming with clear, life-giving water. She carried it, sloshing, back to the cabin. The Millers drank, their eyes wide with disbelief and gratitude. The water was not just a drink. It was a promise. It was hope. For 2 days, as the storm howled, the 5 of them and 1 old mare sheltered in the small cabin. Warmed by a small fire, safe from the tempest, they survived. Mr. Miller, his face streaked with dust and awe, looked at her. "We thought we were done for," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This place, this water, it's a miracle." Alara just shook her head. It wasn't a miracle. It was just listening. When the storm finally broke, the world was remade. The sky was a newly washed blue, and the air was clean and sharp. The landscape was muted, softened by a fresh blanket of sand. The Millers, their gratitude immense, helped Alara right their wagon. Much of what they owned was lost, but they were alive. Before they set off toward the distant silhouette of Redemption Creek, Mr. Miller pressed a worn gold coin into her hand. "This is for the water," he said, his voice firm. "I know it's not enough. Nothing would be enough." Alara tried to refuse, but he insisted. "You didn't just give us water, ma'am. You gave us back our lives." When the Miller family limped into town, their story spread faster than a prairie fire. But it wasn't a story about the crazy Vance girl digging her own grave. It was a story of a quiet, resourceful woman who had provided shelter and succor in the heart of a killer storm. And they spoke of the water. They described it with a reverence usually reserved for scripture, telling of a well of the purest, sweetest water they had ever tasted, drawn from the middle of a barren wasteland. The townspeople fell silent. The snickers and whispers of pity died in their throats, replaced by a stunned, collective disbelief. Jedediah Thorne heard the tale in the saloon, and for once had no booming laugh or dismissive comment. He saddled his black stallion and rode out himself, a deep frown etched on his face. He found Alara calmly resetting a few stones of the wellhead that the storm had loosened. He saw the repaired cabin, no longer a ruin but a home. He saw the deep, clear water in the bucket beside her. He dismounted, his movements stiff. "They say you have water," he stated, his voice flat. Alara said nothing. She simply dipped a tin cup into the bucket and held it out to him. He took it, his eyes never leaving hers. He drank, a long, deep swallow. He lowered the cup, and the look on his face was not one of anger, but of profound, unadulterated shock. The truth of it, the impossible reality, had washed away his arrogance. "I'll buy it," he said, his voice now a low murmur. "I'll give you $500 for this land. Right now. Cash." Alara took the cup from his hand. "It's not for sale, Mr. Thorne," she said quietly. He stared at the well, then back at her, and for the first time, he looked not at the daughter of the town eccentric, but at a woman who held the future of the valley in her hands. He nodded slowly, a gesture of defeat and, perhaps, a flicker of respect. He mounted his horse and rode away without another word. Soon others came. Silas Croft was the first, a wide, proud grin splitting his weathered face. He pumped her hand, his eyes shining. "I knew it," he said, though he hadn't. "Your father," he knew. Then came the ranchers, their hats in their hands, their demeanor respectful, almost timid. They asked if they might fill a few barrels for their thirsty cattle, offering to pay. She never took money, but she would trade a bucket of water for a bag of feed for Dusty, or for fresh vegetables. Finally, a buggy arrived carrying Mr. Abernathy, the county surveyor from the territorial capital. He was a quiet, scholarly man with spectacles and gentle hands. He brought scientific instruments with him. He tested the water, he took depth soundings, and he spent a full day studying her father's maps, his brow furrowed in concentration. At the end of the second day, he folded his spectacles and looked at Alara with a deep and genuine admiration. "Your father wasn't just a cartographer, Miss Vance," he said, his voice filled with awe. "He was a visionary, a hydrologist of genius. These maps, they are decades ahead of their time. This isn't just a well, it's a tap into the Redemption Aquifer, a significant groundwater system no one knew existed. This discovery," he paused, looking out at the once barren land, "this will change everything." The chorus of townspeople, once a source of mockery, had shifted to a tone of reverence. They no longer saw Alara Vance, the defeated daughter. They saw the quiet, steadfast keeper of the desert's most vital secret. A season turned, and the land began to answer the water's call. The 160 acres of cracked earth were slowly, subtly transforming. Where Alara had diverted the overflow from the well, a patch of impossible green had appeared, a small, thriving vegetable garden that was a miracle in the pale landscape. Wildflowers no one had seen in a generation began to bloom along the damp edges of the soil. The plot was no longer called the Barrens. Travelers and locals alike began to refer to it as Vance's Well. It had become a landmark, a point of life and hope on the vast, empty map of the territory. Alara never sold the water, but a system of trade and goodwill had sprung up around it. A passing family might leave a sack of flour, a rancher a side of bacon. Her cabin was now a home, sturdy and comfortable, with a small porch she had built herself. It was a sanctuary she had built with her own two hands, out of her father's legacy and her own unyielding spirit. The final scene unfolds at golden hour, that magical time when the sun sits low on the horizon, bathing the world in a warm, forgiving light. Alara was sitting on her porch steps, the familiar weight of a worn leather harness in her lap, her needle and awl moving with a practiced, steady rhythm. Dusty grazed nearby, her coat sleek and healthy, a living testament to good water and gentle care. The silence was deep and peaceful, punctuated only by the chirp of a cricket and the soft nicker of the mare. A wagon appeared on the horizon, a dark shape crawling slowly toward her. It was a common sight now. She set aside her mending and waited. It was a young family, their faces etched with the weariness of a long journey, their wagon piled high with the humble possessions that constituted their worldly hopes. The father, a thin man with kind, anxious eyes, approached the porch, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. "Ma'am?" he asked, his voice hesitant, almost timid. "We heard in the last town a story about this place. Is this the place with the water?" Alara looked up from her work. She looked past the man, at his wife holding a small child on the wagon seat, at the vast expanse of the desert stretching out behind them. It was the same land that had once seemed so menacing, so empty. But she no longer saw it that way. She saw the hidden lines, the secret patterns, the deep, sleeping river that sustained it all. She saw a world not of scarcity, but of secret promise. She turned her gaze back to the man's hopeful face, and a small, genuine smile touched her lips. She nodded. "This is the place," she said, her voice quiet but clear, carrying the weight of all she had learned. "My father didn't leave me land. He taught me how to listen for it." She stood, brushing the leather scraps from her apron, and walked with him to the well to help him draw the cool, clear water. The sun dipped below the mountains, setting the sky ablaze with color, bathing the small green homestead in a final golden light. Her father's inheritance wasn't dirt. It was a language, and she was, at last, fluent. Thank you for joining us on this journey to Redemption Creek. It's a powerful reminder that true inheritance is often found in the wisdom we carry, not the property we own. If you were moved by Alara's story of quiet determination, please leave a like and a comment, and subscribe for more tales of the unseen strength that shapes our world. We'll have another story for you soon.